All right, so welcome to our last session, everyone. This is exciting in some ways, I think, in the sense for me that we've sort of we now have the opportunity to take a bird's eye view to the Girardian apparatus and to revisit the text, Violence in the Sacred, from a kind of angle that I think will be looser than we have maybe done before, which has been very textual. We can still refer to the text if you want, but I thought tonight it would be interesting for us to sort of map some of the conceptual architecture of what Girard is up to. And I think the best place to start with that is actually with a concept he developed in his dissertation on Deceit, the Novel, and Desire, which is looking at literature and desire, which is where he really developed the theory of mimetic desire. And one of the most important concepts from that text is what he calls the triangle of desire. So I want to start there because once we start with the triangle of desire and we sort of locate the architecture of the Girardian mimetic system of desire, we can then examine the precise point where violence and the sacred emerge. And we should remember that violence and the sacred are almost, as Girard intimates towards the second to last chapter, they are almost synonymous. It's super important and super counterintuitive that one would actually define the sacred and violence so intimately as interwoven, right? So the triangle of desire, I think we could locate this. And if you want the reference here, it's really in the opening and then second and third chapters of his first book on the novel and desire, if you want the reference there. And one of the ways you can think about this sort of triangle, this sort of tripartite or three-part movement, is to think about the relationship that Don Quixote had between Sancho and his sort of higher knight, the higher knight that he aspired to. I forget the immediate name of this figure, but it was the kind of mythical, transcendental mediator of his desire to remain within the knightly cosmos, which, of course, the irony of the novel of Don Quixote by Cervantes is that he's duped, yet so comfortable in his state of being duped that the grand project that he's seeking, which is the sort of nobility of realizing the full knight errantry and all of that, is completely historically foreclosed. Yet Sancho's desire also remains tethered, but as a model of Don Quixote's desire, not as the sort of the real rivalrous relationship on the one hand, but then Sancho, as his grand assistant, also keeps Quixote tethered to the fantasy, right? By never adequately challenging it and so on, right? So Girard uses that text as an example of the triangle of desire, but he also uses Proust's In Search of Lost Time also as well, and many, many other examples. What he's giving us is a highly structural account of of mimetic desire. So let's just look through these movements one by one. We know that the birth of a subject, in the Spinozist sense, that desire is at the kind of origin point. But what type of desire is at the origin of subjectivity? And the answer is that it's not that the subject actually desires the same object. We already reviewed this before. We shouldn't think about it in that vulgar sense, right? It's not that, you know, the father is a firefighter, the son desires to become a firefighter. It's rather that the more abstract form of the model of the father's desire is what is being imitated, is the site of the mimetic rivalry. It's the model. So it's this kind of doubling effect. And so the first claim then is that the object is something which is produced in the relationship of the rival to the model, right? So yes, it is true that the father has a kind of rivalrous relationship with the son at times, but it's also true that the son can have a rivalrous relationship, obviously, with the brother, right? Or even with the sister, for that matter. So the rivalry is over the question of the model, and the desire is produced in this kind of constitutive conflict, let's say. So that's movement number one. And I think we cannot really speak of a subject for Girard without this original movement, okay? The second movement, and he calls this, I'm calling it movement, but he calls it the first form of desire. He calls this the first form of desire, model or rival to model, okay? The second form of desire, or what I'm calling the second movement, moves from model to mediator, right? So you think about it for a moment. If the subject is a kind of entity which at a certain moment has the realization that the construction of the first form of desire was actually based for the rival that it was engaged with, is actually based on the introduction of a third presence, of a mediator. This is what introduces what we can generally call transcendence, okay? And this second form of desire is where the trouble starts. This is where violence in the sacred sort of begins, in some sense, right? It's at the conjecture, or the kind of intersection of a crisis of the mediator obstacle, because the mediator also produces an obstacle, and that obstacle is structural, right? It's maybe the case that in certain cosmos or certain social orders, mediators would not produce obstacles. Like, you think, for example, of like Greek narcissism. In the cosmos of Greek narcissism, okay, desire might obfuscate itself structurally, but it's not going to obfuscate it structurally itself in the same way that we have in the modern period, right? So there's something about modernity, although Girard, as we'll look at, especially with the critique that Gillian Rose gives to Girard, we'll see that she raises the point that the whole Girardian system of mimetic desire and also of violence in the sacred is sort of premised on a strange, almost thesis that we were never modern in a certain way. And why? Well, because the whole idea of the continuity between and necessity of traditional societies and their kind of the modern forgetting of the necessity of things like sacrifice and things like the scapegoat mechanism and so on, sort of indicates that Girard is positing a type of continuity between the pre-modern and the modern, which we can talk about in a little bit, okay? So we have first form, first movement, rival to model. We have second movement, model to mediator. And I said this movement of model to mediator produces an obstacle. Now, an obstacle should be understood here as like that which can be a problem or can be a solution. It can be thought of in both ways. What's an example of that? An example of that, I think, from psychoanalysis would be that the mediator would be something like the ego ideal, let's say, right? Or something like, if the father desires to be a firefighter, at some point, the child is freed from the pressure of the rivalry to become that very thing or something like that, when the child realizes that the introduction of a kind of, I don't know, let's call it like a legacy of service that was passed down within the, this is a sort of cheesy example, but I think you get my point. In other words, the transcendental of the higher ideal that is produced from the first movement, you know, in a certain, let's call it stable order or stable social order, or a social order that has no outbreak of mimetic violence, yeah, or like a sort of semi, let's say, harmonious social order, the mediator obstacle can kind of be managed. It's still going to produce an obstacle, but you can sort of work through it, right? And so one of the crises of modernity has been precisely this notion that the mediator obstacle produces a kind of schizophrenia. It produces an irresolvable double, right? An irresolvable form of the double bind, right? So the double bind point is kind of lodged in some sense at this moment, okay? And then in the third movement, what I've put here is the subject reverses the role of mediator to hide desire and to hide imitation once mediator has revealed the object of desire. So remember, we've talked a lot about, and Girard obviously is very fond of this idea, that part of the necessity of the scapegoat mechanism is actually to keep the emergence of violent mimesis or a certain form of mimetic desire, to keep it displaced and to keep it contained, right? Well, in the Girardian view of mimetic desire, and especially in this notion of things hidden since the foundation of the world, he sort of gives us a theory of a kind of deadlock in some sense. Like, in other words, why desire for Girard is a sort of negative emergence, right? And why humanity struggles to sort of mitigate or manage desire, et cetera, has to do with the notion that we need the introduction of a kind of a third like if the mediator obstacle, I guess we can put it this way. What I've put here for the third movement and defined it here is sort of a kind of pessimistic account, right? It's a pessimistic account for the deadlock of number two, right? In other words, it's sort of like Girard's theory of repression. And that's very important because by no means is Girard offering a kind of utopic view of desire. No, he's actually saying that the triangle of desire leads to a type of repressive solution. So the way that I've described it here, I think is actually correct, okay? And it then becomes a question of critique, which is that movement of hiding or of concealment, right? Concealment of the mimetic principle at play becomes the basis of what novels and even poets and religion and so on can unveil, you see? So the fact that it's hidden is not totally pessimistic, because there are prophets and sages and writers and visionaries that can, in fact, open it up, can reveal it. I hope that makes sense to you. So that's the sort of general framework. Now, I'm going to come back to this, but I want to now move here. So if we go to the impasse of the second movement, right? Because keep in mind, in the third movement, the fact that it's hidden still is pessimistic in some grand sense, but in reality, it's a necessary concealment. And we'll see why here, because in this movement, and this is what we might call the sort of graph of violence in the sacred, what I'm calling the emergence and containment of sacred violence. And I put sacred slash violence because, again, they're so close, right? So just moving from original murder, original victim, remember that the sort of social order that Freud identified in Totem and Taboo, founded on patricidal murder, is in fact a very cogent analysis of the kind of originary crime of the social, right? Therefore, it's often the case that mimetic violence can emerge when you have, and you would have to sort of superimpose this graph, when you have a breakdown here at the second movement. So think about that second movement as here in the outbreak of mimetic violence. And this is what I'm calling the sacred uncontained, because remember, Girard has a lot to say about the way in which the sacred produces violence when what that signifies is that the sacred, which is normally kept at bay, for which the sacrificial rites or the sacrificial killing of the animal is meant to sort of pay homage to the exterior sacred. So it's very much the case that the sacred violence is the transcendence now becoming imminent, right? And we already know that transcendence becoming imminent is another definition of a tragic social order. And we already know that a tragic social order is one in which distinctions have collapsed, and you have emerged a kind of anti-hero, right? An anti-hero who can, in the case of Oedipus, sort of inhabit a multiplicity of roles across the family. And we also know that in the tragic cosmos, violence is sort of redoubled as an internal gesture, right? So family against family, race against race, tribe against tribe, and so on and so forth, right? In some sense, external directed violence is capable of containing the sacred. So I really feel that sacred violence is very much a kind of internal civil war structure in some sense, right? So I'm calling this the breakdown in mediator subject relation. And this is what Girard actually calls it in the last chapter. So that's important. Now, as a solution, a surrogate victim who stands in as the original victim is kind of a double. And remember, the purpose of the surrogate victim is to enact. Remember that the outbreak shows that all of the edifice of the hierarchy of one's social roles and so on, the kind of stability of the society, is totally imploded. The surrogate victim is meant to sort of represent that implosion, but they are chosen randomly. That's super important. And closely related to the logic of surrogate victim is the logic of the monstrous double. And the monstrous double, you could think of as the original murder. So think of original victim as surrogate victim and monstrous double as original murder. You see the point? Which is why they both almost serve to satiate the same function in some sense, which is to mitigate the mimetic upsurge of violence, right? And we saw this with the Dionysian Euripides Bacchae, for example. It's the same structure there. Then at a next level, we have the question, which I'm posing, and I think Girard poses this very much as well, which is that a social order needs to sort of make a decision. Are they going to decide, and it's very interesting, by the way, that, and I think I have the quote of it in a moment, but he performs a very nice etymological breakdown of sacrifice, and he shows how sacrifice is actually linked to the question of decision. So the question of providing a sacrifice as a grand solution to, you could almost think of surrogate victim or monstrous double as a kind of physical solution. Then you could think of sacrifice and scapegoat victim as a kind of metaphysical solution. Do you see my point? Because in the sacrifice option, it's a abstracted right. You know what I'm saying? That is meant to sort of mimic the original murder or the original victim as an homage to it and as a warning to keep it at bay, right? And that then contains the outbreak, right? And then he actually, if you remember in the very last chapter, talks about how vaccines are examples of sacrificial mechanisms of modern life, in the sense that the vaccine should be thought of as a kind of inoculation to the containment of sacred violence as well. And now the reason that I put or, sacrifice or scapegoat victim, is because if we go back here, you know, this whole business of the second movement, of what you might call a spiritual crisis, according to Girard. Why is it a spiritual crisis? In a paradoxical sense, it's a spiritual crisis because we haven't decided on an adequate scapegoat victim. So therefore, the sacred has both an inside and an outside presence. You see my point? Like there's a kind of inability to decide. And so it then becomes an ethical problem, right? And that's why I say that modernity is plagued by a disguised scapegoat victim, right? And this is also why Girard is big on this notion of the crisis of difference, and why Deleuze and Guattari are basically trying to double down on the crisis of difference by following the crisis of difference all the way to the end, right? And he argues in so doing, what they're basically doing is creating a kind of hyper-modern new myth that fails because it doesn't adequately address this structural presence of scapegoat victim, right? And I have some quotes to sort of elaborate that a little bit more. But I want to make sure that all of this is sort of generally clear, and let me know if you have any thoughts at this point.
Daniel, I have a just a clarification question.
Sure.
When you were saying, think of the surrogate victim as the original victim,
Yeah.
and the monstrous double as the original murder, would you mind just clarifying the difference between the original victim and the original murder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in some sense, the original murder would be the monstrous act that the brothers did to the father in Totem and Taboo, or that in Moses and Monotheism, the act of murder of the founding father of the religious community. And in another sense, the enactment of that is not so much an enactment of, because who's the victim in those scenarios? Because remember, Freud will say, well, Girard's reading of Freud will say that actually at the end of this drama, the heroic sacrificial subject is in fact the father. And that what the murder of the father allows is taking the father outside of the paternal order or outside of paternity as such. And then he then raises, you know, a whole bunch of sort of theoretical problems that he has with Freud's movement there, namely the fact that Freud didn't fully recognize that. But what I said you could sort of think about them in those two ways is just in the sense that the monstrous double is often talked about in the ethnographical examples that Girard cites as the one who mimics the monstrous father before he becomes a hero, is all that I meant. Like, in other words, the monstrous double is the one who is possessed with the sacred in his body, right? So he becomes the physical proof of the mimetic contagion housed within himself, right?
I see.
The surrogate victim is the one who's chosen from outside. It's usually, the logic there, as a reminder, is the pharmakos, okay? And they are anonymous, because this is important. If the introduction of a mimetic breakdown and collapse of the social order, stasis, violence, and so on, creates a problem of identity, it's pure difference. It's pure difference. We have no efficacy of stability of, like, even like, I was listening to a really interesting critique of the BLM protests, where they said the police are in a very interesting predicament today, which is that the people that they discipline and keep in line are at the origin of the animus and the disdain that they have towards the police. And the very people who they work for their interests, like namely private property owners, the wealthy, have an equal disdain for the police. Why? Because in some sense, the very novel fact of BLM is that you have this huge middle-class white, which is a positive thing, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, but it creates a strange exclusionary feeling for the police. In some sense, it's very unclear who they're serving, because on the one hand, their masters have a sort of symbolic disdain for them. And then on the other hand, the actual people that they police, who the people they're doing it for, are standing in a weird, so they're kind of caught in the middle in some sense, is what I'm trying to say. And it's that interesting fact, which means that there's a sort of total collapse of identity in some sense. Does that make sense? Like, there's a kind of, so what the surrogate victim does is functions as a kind of stand-in for the collapse. And therefore its selection can be arbitrary, and it usually is from outside. It's usually from outside, right? Of the community, right? Now, so the scapegoat, so what I said was that surrogate victim and monstrous double are kind of like physical. I could actually plug in my thing and write this down. Maybe that would be helpful. But I said this is sort of like a physical instantiation. Like, in other words, monstrous double is physically taken over or possessed. And surrogate victim is like literally chosen, right? But the scapegoat victim is actually more of a mechanism. Girard refers to it more as a mechanism. And its mechanism is similar to the sacrificial rite in a certain sense. In other words, it has to be thought of as a kind of ever-present solution to the emergence of violence. Like, in other words, there's this very strange paradoxical, I don't even know if it's a paradox, but it's a very startling point, which is that according to some ethnological research, societies, so-called primitive societies, whatever, that's a bad term, that did not have the prohibition on incest, also had a tendency not to commit warfare, right? So there's a certain sense in which that was satiated, that urge or that structural thing. And so I think in some sense, the scapegoat victim is used or brought about to ensure that this triangle has a certain efficacy, we might say, right? So it doesn't get hung up with the crisis of transcendence. You see my point? And this is why when we look at Girard's whole theory on what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, he's basically making the claim that they don't understand that the symbolic, this whole notion of the Lacanian symbolic, has to be founded on a scapegoat mechanism. And I'll show you some quotes to sort of clarify that. Anyways, I know that was a long-winded thing. Sorry.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I mean, I'm starting to side with Girard here. I know I've been kind of giving him a hard time, but I'm starting to see what he's talking about, and it took a long time of him sort of jostling psychoanalysis away from sort of his story to kind of separate the two.
Yeah.
To really hammer this home. So I'm thankful that he does spend a lot of time now sort of giving Freud a hard time. I see what he's saying. This is bigger than psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is sort of within the culture. Right. And what I think Girard's talking about is this is culture, which is different. Right. I think it's a really important angle. So
let's examine a little bit more of that. So I think it would be helpful. Okay, by the way, his essay on Anti-Oedipus, I must confess, is one of the most interesting things I've read in years. So I swear to God, I mean, I read that thing line by line, and I reread every sentence, and I read it. It took me like 5 hours to read that thing. I read it so slowly. I loved it. It's just a couple passages from here. This is called Delirium as System. Now, if you haven't read the Anti-Oedipus project, then it's going to be a little bit difficult to follow, but I think you can still get a lot from it. So here he says, the mimetic definition of desire allows us to, quote, explain rivalry without the Oedipus complex. It brings forth an unlimited number of doubles without referring to myth or the nuclear family. We find ourselves in the presence of a very general conception whose relation to mythical, tragic, and psychoanalytical Oedipus must be clarified. It is evident that the Oedipal crisis, as Freud envisions it, carries undeniable, mimetic elements that are variable and never precisely stated. On the other hand, the mimetic relation is opposed to the Oedipal structure by its destructuring quality. Assuredly, mimetic desire is always inscribed in the existing structure that it tends to subvert. This does not mean at all that it can be defined as imaginary. So what he's trying to say there is that the myth that Freud is offering through the Oedipus complex is limited, highly limited, because it is just a sort of echo of this structure, which we've already outlined, of mimetic desire itself. So I found that interesting, and I found it interesting because there's so much of a kind of questioning today around the family as a vector of authority or of repression or of inequality, right? And the idea of the abolition of the family that is coming from contemporary Marxist thought is very central. And psychoanalysis is pigeonholed because it, in a popular sense, makes the claim that in fact, we need to preserve a kind of or fortify subjectivity if we adopt the Oedipus logic, or the Oedipus complex idea. It's a sort of one vulgar idea, I think, that we all sort of in a popular sense share, is that subjectivity necessitates a type of harmonious or well-defined or distinguished family structure. And I think that it's very much the case, and when you saw those 2 chapters on Freud in this Violence in the Sacred, that what Girard is offering here is a kind of really interesting circumnavigation around the necessarily structured theory of pleasure and desire that is so fundamentally tethered to the triangle of Oedipus. Because if the triangle of mimetic desire is structured like this, and it's kind of what Cade called a kind of, I think you used the word synthetic, in this kind of highly synthetic, almost like abstract structure, it can be applied across a multiplicity of scenarios, not just this kind of highly localized familial one, which is highly reliant on the father and the father's authority and all of the Freudian stuff. Then what I'm trying to say, long story short, is that I think then Girard gives us a certain tool or a certain way against psychoanalysis in some sense. Now, what Lacan will do with Freud is totally separate, and that's a whole separate line of argumentation, which, as the Slovenes have indicated, Oedipus is actually a story about how the transgression of normativity from the family is the sort of final movement of Oedipus. In other words, like, long story short, is that to be Oedipal, or to think that the kind of Oedipal triangle is sort of the transcendental of social life, which is what Deleuze and Guattari argue, right? They'll make the claim that, the kind of Kantian a priori is a sort of finds its structure in Oedipus. So it's not that, the psychoanalyst invents Oedipus. It's that all subjectivity invents Oedipus by virtue of the structure of or a relationship between psyche and the social, right? That it's kind of, there's a necessary constructive double-bind constricture also, right? So all I'm trying to say is that I think Girard, if you read him in a sort of subversive way, gives us a few ways to sort of push the psychoanalytic theory a little bit, but we can come back to that. That's just my intuition right now. Here's a nice, another passage. So if capitalism is schizophrenic, which means what? Let's read this passage. I think this is very helpful because we can then place it back onto the graph that I created. He says, quote, delirium is nothing but the obligatory outcome of a desire that embeds itself in the impasse of the obstacle model. Now think back to the graph I just made. That's the impasse. The impasse in question is the most general form of the double bind that Batson sees as the source of psychosis. All desires ultimately trap each other in a contradictory double injunction. Imitate me, do not imitate. When effects of the universal double bind become too extreme to stay hidden, we speak of psychosis. And naturally, the observation of these extreme effects for the first time reveals the double bind as a relation of desire. So in the third movement, in general, we have a repressive society which hides. Yeah. What Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do is ride the second wave without going into the third. There's one nice, easy way to think about what they're trying to do here. And the second wave is the double heightened, the crisis heightened. And that kind of goes back to the whole theme of their project as accelerationist. Okay, so I think that's a very helpful way to understand the stakes of their project, personally. There's a lot more to say about delirium as system. I can just say a couple quick things. I mean, he has all of this business about religion and myth, right? Which is that, you know, a kind of mythical emergence for Girard, if we're thinking about it here, would be one in which the mediator obstacle is sort of placed back in within a kind of discursive cosmos, or is sort of sublimated through art, maybe we could say, right? And you'll know in Deleuze's philosophy in particular, he has the idea that we need to actually get outside of this idea of the sacred. And keep in mind, the sacred is never mentioned. And Girard mentions this as well. It's barely mentioned in Lacan, and it's barely mentioned at all. If it is, it's invoked in a negative sense for Deleuze. So the idea of Deleuze is to sort of flip the problem into the solution, right? And to create a kind of a theory of the sacred, which would no longer be based on a repressive, sublimatory structure of, like, this notion of reading the secret of the desire of the novelist. Like, you read a novel or a poem or a piece of literature to discover a kind of depth that's rendered hidden. This is a sort of standard motif, right? You'll know in the Deleuzean philosophy, everything is more significant at the surface. So the truth is a surface effect. It's nothing interesting at the depths, right? So what I see Girard is basically saying is that yes, mimetic desire is a fact of human exchange, of human life, and yes, it produces a certain form of an unconscious, but it's not the Freudian form of the mythical unconscious, which is fundamentally linked to a sexual relation to pleasure and all of that. Actually, it's based on this structure, right? So it's like a different theory of repression, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So, however, I also asked you all to take a look at Gillian Rose's critique of Girard as the Gnostic, and I want to point out a couple of things from her analysis, which I find just amazing. This is in the broken middle in her. So she has a section on, it's called Myth Out of the Hands of Fascists. And it's an analysis of myth and violence in Thomas Mann and in René Girard. And so the second part is on Girard. And her basic argument here is that, and this is what we might call Girard's Nietzscheanism, by the way. Her basic argument is that, look, the breakdown of violence occurs here in this kind of crisis point. But for Rose, what's interesting about that is that it's very much a Nietzschean theme of the emergence of violence, because it's predicated, and this was a critique that I had, and you remember several sessions ago I was talking about this. It's predicated on a collapse of, or on the introduction of egalitarianism, or of some kind of collapse of distinction, right? So I say that that's this kind of core Nietzscheanism. We can return to that in a moment. The other point I want to point out here is she says, Girard thinks of the victim as the contagion of the internal mediation of desire, that one catches one's desire, as it were, from one's neighbor, who may well have caught them from oneself in the first place, the mimetic, the double, and the effect of the first movement. Desire is thereby redoubled by being shared. And this double or reciprocal or negative mediation of imitation defines modern society. So I like that point of the problem actually is this third movement of the notion of the impossibility to share desire, because I feel like all of this residue of the psychoanalytic and now Girardian reading of social stability or social violence, actually another way to understand it is in the same sense that Lacan would make this non-rapport of the sexual relation. In other words, it's very interesting to me that Rose reads Girard as basically saying that violence is also about a kind of impossibility to share desire. I really like that point. And I think that it's a challenging point, which is not necessarily a rationalist, grounded in a rationalist theory. What do I mean by that? Well, it's right here. So check this out. Rose's main critique of Girard is the following. Principles no longer cause rivalry. It is a metaphysical rivalry, which slips into contrary principles. So what does that mean? I think what she's saying here is sort of staying true to a kind of Hegelian philosophical understanding of violence, which is actually around the clash of two rights. In other words, the double bond, or the emergence of violence in a social order could in some sense be thought of in this archaic pre-modern structure that Girard is elaborating with the mimesis outbreak. However, there's another way to think about the emergence of violence, which is a sort of more discursive or rational conflict over things like values, or like, in other words, if you think about, let's say, something like a conflict like the Vietnam War, let's say, if the Vietnam War was an ideological conflict, which was about the imposition of the adoption of an ideological system to govern certain territories, right, in the developing world, communism or capitalism, is it really adequate to analyze that conflict from a Girardian lens as this, deep metaphysical phenomenon? See my point? Versus a conflict over principles, versus a conflict that's based in a contestation of reason and rationality. You see my point? So what she calls this is tradition and prophecy in the severe style, which is cynical. She says, quote, an absolute end, all desires mobilized in the service of nothingness. This is what she says of Girard, from which only the novelist who gives up being an eternal victim and gives up seeing his beloved as a monstrous divinity may convert. Girard's Gnosticism is based on the, quote, move to abolish the ethical instead of suspending and releasing it. So this is a whole Kierkegaardian theme that she raises here. So the idea of Kierkegaard was that, the question of the impasse that Girard is dealing with vis-a-vis the double bind and of this crisis of transcendence, Kierkegaard would call this the ethical, right? And what Rose is saying is that Girard circumvents any possibility of a kind of reason or rational-based resolution to this impasse, and sort of falls back on a kind of archaic theory of tradition and religion, which makes sense. In other words, in Girard's theory of the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, what Rose will say is that by no means does he give us an analysis grounded in what Hegel grounded the master-slave dialectic in, which is what? Which is the contradictions of bourgeois society. Yeah? And the contradictions of bourgeois society are contradictions which are founded on rhetoric and discourse and language and reason. For Girard, things are not really mediated that way. Things are more primally mediated, right? So it's worth considering that. Furthermore, for Girard, she says, principles no longer cause rivalry. It is a metaphysical rivalry, which slips into contrary principles. So that's the key point. And I'm actually leaning, I don't know about you, but now that we move out of the Girardian cave, we can kind of critique his edifice with a little more clarity, perhaps. So yeah, okay, so we've already gone through this. So yes. So Gnosticism, she says, is the abolishment of the ethical. So once this is granted, the moment will be imperceptible, for the movement of faith does not take place in time, or takes place in every moment of time. Whereas if the ethical is abolished, then a time outside time, or a social reality outside social reality, must illogically be posited. Now, to visualize that, I think that we can look back here to the very idea of the scapegoat mechanism itself. Okay, why? Because what this is seeking to do is solve the problem of the sacred by putting it back in its place, which is the very thing that she's talking about here, which is not confronting the deadlock of the ethical. The deadlock of the ethical then is, in Girard's language, in Violence in the Sacred, is basically what? Well, it is the emergence of sacred violence and the particular treatment that it is given, I guess you could say. So what she claims is that he's operating on this kind of almost like archaic regression. I think it's very much regression, right? To this sort of, and this is why, by the way, the Girardians think that he has discovered a science of the humanities, right? But here we have a great Hegelian philosopher, Gillian Rose, saying, no. This is conflating the pre-modern with the modern, and it's not adequately contending with the Hegelian insight of the post-French Revolutionary social order, right? I think I have one more quote on this here. So this is a very nice one. I put rational Hegelianism versus Gnosticism. She says, quote, the challenge is to cease this abolition of the ethical. Remember, he wants to abolish it because it's always a deadlock, remember? Remember the movement in movement point 3 that I put there? It's always a repressive movement. It's always something that goes hidden. Yeah? That's what she means by abolition of the ethical. And to restore the
Daniel,
political... Please.
Sorry, yeah, I just had a question. Is this also because the abolition of the ethical, then in some sense, the ethical is a conscious grappling with the violence, whereas the Girardian move, like the scapegoat must necessarily be an unconscious mechanism. So to precisely bring up the ethical,
Yeah.
is to sabotage that. Is that what she's kind of getting
Yeah,
at as well?
yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right, which is he's looking for a displacement of it. He's making a claim in a pessimistic way that in some sense, the restoration of distinction or the establishment of a more harmonious social order can only be conditioned on the realization that the very idea of the symbolic, which makes reasoned deliberation and exchange possible, is still founded on a scapegoat mechanism, which is something that the post-Hegelian philosophers disavow. Yeah, but their disavowing of that is the suspension of the ethical, what Kierkegaard calls the suspension of the ethical. And the suspension of the ethical is a kind of, this is why Antigone is the great, what Hegel called the great irony of the community, right? Because what Antigone does is reveals the monstrosity, the monstrous double at the origin of the law, and sustains that monstrosity so that it can be worked through, right? In the same sense that Hegel's notion of ethical life, which is the kind of movement of spirit to a stage of existence that has transcended master-slave dialectic, yeah, is also a type of working through of the ethical. It's not keeping it at abeyance. What he's trying to do is abolish the question entirely, right? So he has a kind of triangular solution to it, but it's not a progressive one in some sense. It's not one that is leading to a new humanity, let's say, right? So I think it's in this sense that Rose gives us the best critique of Girard here and makes it all very clear that a Gnostic is actually one who makes the claim that desire is ultimately no mystery at all. It's founded on nothing. Yeah? It's the effect of a rivalry that goes back into a circle of repression and hit a kind of concealment. Yeah, and then in the second saga, it emerges as violence. You see my point? But ultimately, it's a negative piece. Whereas in the kind of alternative Christian Hegelian view, desire actually, yes, emerges as an anxious spirit of life, and it kind of animates in ways that are violent, but not exclusively so, right? And that there's a kind of dialectical treatment of the emergence of it, which at some point, Hegel will call the suspension of the ethical and so on, and we can look at Kierkegaard's essay on that as well. But I think this is the contrast. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is a really nice way to kind of bird's eye view what's going on here. Let me finish this quote. The challenge is to cease this abolition of the ethical and to restore the political history of ethical life. This is what Rose is saying we need to do. We need to do this without the cynicism of violence, without the facetiousness of myth, but not without authorial irony, not without the anxiety of beginning and the equivocation of the middle. This irony has been learnt. This is why the suspension of the ethical is also a confrontation with the thirdness, which is not in the delirium of the two, of the schizophrenic two, but in what she calls the middle, by the way. This irony has been learnt from the pseudonymous one. It is the lesson that the most existential moment of the ethical suspension is the most consistent witnessing of the history of ethical and political actuality. So I love this argument, which is that we need to, in a Hegelian sense, tether with the antinomies. We need to work through them. And then we can think about, and this is not like the best diagram for it. We need to actually develop a lot more diagram for it, but we could think about this as almost like a kind of I don't even know if I can. Oh no, I can't write on it yet. Sorry. Yeah, we could think about this triangle here almost as a kind of what we do with the crisis of transcendence is we suspend the ethical. We interrogate the crisis of values. We interrogate the crisis of transcendence, right? And so I felt like you almost have these kind of like three options that we're studying right now. We have the kind of, in the middle, we have the Rose Hegel tethering with the middle of the two. On the left extreme, we have the Deleuze-Guattari ride the wave of the antinomy without proper resolution. And then we have the Girardian right-wing Gnostic solution, which is abolish the obstacle entirely, right? And that's the other thing I didn't mention. I neglected to mention this. This is a very important point. The scapegoat mechanism is an object. I should have mentioned this. He calls this the object, which is very important because here, mediator obstacle, the obstacle could be thought of also as the production of a new object. That's a very helpful way to visualize it, actually, if you think about it, which is that what's at play is how to treat this object in some sense, right? And that's where Girard is basically saying religious abolition is the answer, right? So, and then, I neglected to look at this. This is an interesting little side point about prohibition. This is in his reading of Deleuze and Guattari, by the way. He says, I think this is very significant because you'll remember, and even if you haven't read the Anti-Oedipus, it's obviously intuitive that in the very name of the book, Anti-Oedipus, it is a book around living a life that is capable of circumnavigating prohibitions in general, right? And so Girard says, prohibition is only the violence of the crisis suddenly interrupted by the scapegoat mechanism and transformed into proscription by a community terrified by the idea of falling once more into violence. So what that means is two things. There's a scapegoat mechanism at play, but it's not identified, it's unclear. It's kind of like communities will vie for or contest with one another around which scapegoat mechanism might be adequate. For example, in the liberal cosmos, there is a certain form of scapegoat mechanism which might be reducible to the site of civil society, I would say, right? It's at the site of civil society that we can handle antagonisms. We can they can have a kind of presence and a kind of correspondence there, right? So tolerance and freedom of speech and these kind of values, right? Whereas in the Marxist orientation, the scapegoat mechanism is identified, but it's identified in a way which is calling upon a immediate solution. Like, so the liberal cosmos, you can see why it's much more conducive to capitalism because it already allows for scapegoat mechanism to sort of be revealed in some sense or to be managed in some sense. It still has obviously monstrous others and, imperialism and forms of racism and things of that. So anyways, that's one way to think about it, but there's a kind of communities engage in ways to articulate scapegoat logics is one thing I was thinking. And then he says something interesting about a contemporary theory of right. I want to read this. He says, right, therefore, is itself mimesis, which aims this time no longer at the other's desire, with the dissolving and destructive consequences familiar to us, but rather at unifying violence. Unanimous ritual mimesis combined with prohibitions and the totality of the religious constitutes a real preventative of wandering and conflictual mimesis. Against bad mimesis, therefore, culture knows no other remedy but good mimesis. This is why mimesis is undecidable, notably in Plato, as Derrida demonstrates. Everything touching the sacred is truly undecidable. The scapegoat mechanism furnishes the principle of all decision, even in ritual and para-ritual repetitions, as weak and desacralized as they might become. Decidere in Latin means to decide, in our sense only because it first means to cut with the knife, to kill the sacrificial victim. So I thought that was an interesting point, because what does Girard mean when he says that the scapegoat victim is the structural foundation of the symbolic? And then he furthermore says in there that Lacan couldn't see that, and he has this whole beautiful thing, which is, Deleuze and Guattari never get out of the Lacanian apparatus. And in fact, what they simply do is develop a new theory of initiation into the symbolic. So he says, where the sacred resides in Lacanian thought is in the movement from the imaginary to the symbolic, and that the new initiates of Deleuze and Guattari's work reside in that kind of place. It's a very strange argument, but I thought that was a nice quote. So that's what I got for you guys.
I got a couple of thoughts, especially just on that last part there, because I've been thinking for a while, and especially with this presentation, it almost feels to me like Girard's positing some sort of social seduction theory in the sense of the early Freud, like a little bit of an inverse of that, like as opposed to Freud's seduction theory of hysteria, which then gets sublimated into the Oedipal complex. It's like he's taking the anthropological myths of totem and taboo and going, no, that actually happened. And then even reading that as something of a substitution, even for the Oedipal entry into language, this sort of
right
formation of language from the scapegoat victim of an actual moment of unanimous social violence.
Yes.
That then produces a certain form of repression. And even when we're talking about, when Levi was saying how the scapegoat is unconscious, couldn't you see this scapegoat, as far as it is unconscious, as literally a Vorstellung Repräsentanz? It's a substitution for a stand-in in regard to, I think there's one with the surrogate victim. And it's making me wonder, as far as we're still talking about approaching that Peter Thiel Foundation, if there's maybe something of a research program to try and bring about something like a Laplanche for Girard's work. You know how Laplanche kind of had a sublimated seduction theory. If there's something that can take Girard in a more abstract way, but a real abstraction that's not dependent upon this metaphysical naturalization that forms a sacrificial economy.
Yes, I love that. You always have the best interventions, Cade. I think that's really interesting to think about. But if we follow Gillian Rose to the end, it's kind of hard to be sympathetic to the Gnostic proposal, to be honest. Because I think that what Girard is confronting is something that Hegel was also confronting, but what Girard doesn't adequately convince us of, perhaps, or maybe he does, is of the continuity of the break. So there's a kind of question of periodicity. There's a question of his account of modernity as this continuous through line back to archaic. And I think that even his insistence on taking ethnographical structuralism and using the insights derived there and from anthropology as the means for a new science of desire that is capable of a kind of ahistoricism is very unconvincing to me, to be honest. I don't know. I mean, to me, I think it's like it's not attending to the way in which the modern period, even from the Renaissance up through, I don't know, the 20th century, has undergone so many mutations at the level of social and collective and political reality and truth in life that it just seems a little scanty there. Although if you read the book, which I've been looking at since we last met, I haven't finished it yet, on the novel, Desire, Deceit in the Novel, I do have to credit him for kind of providing this synthetic sort of theory of the triangle of desire. Like, it does work on its own merits. It works there, but what I want to suggest is I'm not sure that it works in Violence in the Sacred, is one way to say it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure that I'm as convinced of the Girardian Gnosticism at the end of reading Violence in the Sacred, is what I'll say.
Yeah, on that I'm wondering a little bit if you got a sense of Rose's critique of Girard's. It seems like it's turned to agape in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. I guess she sees it as something of like a sect as opposed to a church. But I couldn't really grasp that, because especially something like that turned to agape seems to give a little more breathing space than Violence in the Sacred, where it ends up.
Yeah, well, I think he addresses the agape thing in the Things Hidden Since the Foundation, but not in Violence in the Sacred, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I actually haven't read that section, so I would have to go back and read what he says about agape there to sort of construe her critique. But ultimately, it has to do with the sight of love, because love becomes the affect which is the one that is exposed in the context of the collapse of distinction. Like, Hegel will have this famous definition of love, which is love is about holding kind of the nakedness of the other in their subsistence. So it's like love is being ready to allow for the other to subside on you in a kind of almost caring relation, even when the other is unknown. So like a true love, yes, you have the Christian injunction. We know very well what that injunction is. But there's also a kind of love in the context of social violence, which is a kind of love which might stabilize a chaotic social order, is very significant for Hegel. So I think that's another interesting thing. I think the other interesting thing on Hegel here is that it's really more Spinoza, actually, which is that I was doing this like really interesting read on Hegel and decadence, because, you know, decadence is a kind of interesting way to refer to what Girard is talking about, of this violent social order, right? A kind of collapse of distinction, because decadence is, according to Hegel, a society in which the efficacy of the rule of law works, but the norms that govern ethical life do not work. And he actually analyzes the Roman Empire as an example of an empire which can sustain itself for centuries in complete decadence. And of course, for Hegel, a society of decadence is a society in which the metaphysical ground has been completely abandoned. So he actually makes the claim that Why Spinoza is interesting here is because Spinoza shows that it's not actually ethical norms that sustain a society. It's a kind of other level of biological striving. So you can sort of have a theory of the human, which is based on the conatus, right? The kind of striving for self-preservation as the fundamental idea, not so much the establishment of a well-reasoned body politic. I don't know if that distinction is helpful to you, but it was really interesting to me because Hegel would want to see both emerge, right? As a kind of where reason can be actualized in the ideal state. Yet he knew very well that societies without normative principles can exist for many, many years. They can just kind of go on. But it's not exactly tragic. That's the thing. It's like tragic is slightly different than decadent. And I like this idea of decadence because it describes our culture much better than tragic. You know what I mean? It's a much better description, I feel.
With like the Hegelian definition and maybe not like the Oswald Spengler sense of like decadence.
Oh, what does Spengler say about decadence?
I'm not even sure if he specifically says it. I just feel like, you know, you see like kind of esoteric right people or whatever talking about like the decadence of society, like not like it's used in similar terms, something even like not like having like like traditional values or something like that. But having that opposition between its ability to reproduce itself versus having some sort of sense of social moral norms. And how the first can be separated from the other. I feel like the on the right version of decadence, there's this assumption that the separation leads to a collapse, that you can't sustain the two. So I think that's what I'd appreciate from that Hegelian approach, is that no, you can have a kind of like one-sided society for generations.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. This essay I was reading was very brilliant in that sense, because it really showed that Hegel's anthropology emerged as a Spinozist anthropology, also to answer the question on the flip side, sort of like Hegel's anthropology is the opposite of his phenomenology, in the sense that if his phenomenology is around the way in which the mediation of spirit qua reason can kind of permeate a social order in an adequate sense. Well, how do you envision a social order in which humans are reduced or deprived of the metaphysical for long periods of time? And in other words, like where the metaphysical is not the mediating principle, where principles have no efficacy in essence, you know? And so I think that such a scenario is a very dismal one. You know what I mean? And like, it's the same thing of Badiou, and like this kind of the idea that postmodern life is only insists on enjoyment and the body, right? That's sufficient. We don't need a life where higher ideas are necessary structures of life, something like that. It's adequate not to have them. So, in other words, Hegel's anthropology knew very well, and his real philosophy at work knew very well, that social orders can exist untethered from the metaphysical, so to speak. So, anyway, so yeah. Are there any other comments on the violence in the sacred? I realize that we kind of concluded the book, but I want to make sure that folks feel good about our conclusion of it, or have any thoughts on it as we wrap up. Ben, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked it, actually. I mean, I really think he points out something important, and some of the things that I'm sort of interested in are like you know, the questions of ethics and sort of morality, like, you know, part of what I think Girard is kind of saying is that we sort of, how would I say this? Violence is sort of endemic to culture, so you can't eliminate it. So I think a lot of times we kind of like to think with our reason and rational ability, well, why don't we just stop being violent? But I think what he's saying is it's baked into society. And so then we can't eliminate it. All we can do is sort of understand it.
Yeah.
And I think that points to some really sort of interesting contemporary kind of ideas on how you can recognize sort of the limits of what we're capable of, maybe.
Yeah.
And recognize these influences that are maybe a lot stronger than we want to give them credit for.
I agree. I mean, I think for Girard, the existence of rights is a residue of a prior outbreak of violence, which has a whole prehistory going back to an originary violence, right? And there's there's a mimetic reenactment that's necessary, and it can be in I mean, I think that he gives us a lot to work with there. I think that he gives us a good account of the crisis of difference. I think he gives us a good account of the structural scapegoat mechanism in many ways, and how you know, it's very interesting though, because to refer back to that article in the New Inquiry that I posted on Slack, if you reread it, you should try rereading it now that you really have a better grasp of Girard, and you'll see how kind of wrong it is. Because if Girard is correct about scapegoat mechanism, it's not true that a scapegoat mechanism is some kind of disposition that some conservative communities have. Not at all. It's a structural function which is hidden. The whole efficacy of it is that it's hidden. It actually behooves us to bring it out. It behooves a society to sort of bring it out in some way, right? But that then introduces an agonistic contestation to bring it out as well. And I think that's one way to think about political ideological struggle as different contentions about what is an adequate scapegoat and what isn't. You see my point? Like, there are certain things that liberals will reject about the socialist orientation, and vice versa. And so I feel like a lot of those rejections actually come down to questions of contestations over what qualifies as scapegoat and what doesn't. You know what I mean? So yeah, there's a lot in Girard that I like.
I was kind of interested too on maybe you could speak to this. What do you think Foucault would say of Girard?
Oh, well, I think that well, first of all, I think Girard has actually written on Foucault's work, by the way.
Okay.
Number one. Number two, I think that he would see Foucault as a bit innovative, but also as a bit confused, in the sense that where he's innovative, I believe, is in his capacity to unlock epistemological lines of continuity that kind of provide a structure for a whole epoch, right? So I think the best book by Foucault for Girard would probably be The Order of Things. I think the worst one would be his business on ethics and the later Foucault and transgression, because I think that Girard is doesn't nearly have. He has a different kind of pessimism as it pertains to transgression than does Foucault. Maybe both are a bit pessimistic, because the Foucauldian idea of transgression is basically that kind of liberatory acts get mired in a kind of transgression at simultaneous to their overtures.
Okay.
So I don't know that. Although that's an interesting thing, but I need to think about that more. I'm not immediately sure. I don't know if others have thoughts on that, but that's.
Well, they both seem similar in the way that they sort of point to power structures operating sort of underneath society, so that they are sort of pointing to things that we often sort of repress or don't think about or don't see. So I think there's a lot of in some ways, my attraction to psychology is sort of recognizing sort of what we would call the subconscious.
Yeah.
But I think you can also put that in sort of what we miss and what we repress and what society brings and all these things that are sort of beyond ourselves. So I think there's a parallel there of how they sort of look at sort of power.
Yeah.
And Foucault brings out, biopolitical power knowledge,
Yeah.
to sort of show how, as society, we build that up. And I think they both kind of point to the ways that power is operating, sort of outside of our awareness. I think that's what's really interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Although I think Foucault is much better on that than Girard, personally, in many ways. Also, I don't know that Girard would accept the notion of Foucault's theory of the body as something which is forged as an effect of power relations. I think actually Girard would not be comfortable, because I don't actually think that he is a theorist of power, to be honest with you. I think he's a theorist of desire, more so, and in that sense, the rivalrous relation that's at the core, the mimetic desire theory, it's I don't know, where do you see power? Let me put it back onto you. Where do you see power residing there?
Oh, I from a psychological perspective, I see it everywhere. So in other words, you have the influence of society on the individual,
Yeah.
which for some people is crushing. It's depressing. It's anxiety provoking. It's ostracizing. It kills who they are. So desire is nothing, because the other's desire trumps my desire.
Yeah.
So there's lots of power going on there,
Yeah.
and with mimetic desire and mimetic rivalry, there's a contestation of power.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't like to admit it, but it's there. So I think it's wrapped up with desire.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. I tried to show the two forms of desire. One as from rival to model, and so there's power there.
Yeah.
But the second one, which is maybe even the more interesting one, which he calls metaphysical, is from model to obstacle or mediator. And I think it's if the modern experience is one where the mediator, crisis of transcendence, that whole kind of Max Weber notion of like modern life is disenchantment. If we accept that, then one can see that capitalism, and Girard says this a lot, by the way, is a perfect system for mimetic desire, because it actually requires competition, kind of micro power exchanges. And then in that sense, mimetic desire is given free rein. It's given free rein without an outlet.
Yeah.
So Girard's an interesting old conservative in the sense that, or he wouldn't even call himself a conservative, I don't know, but he's an interesting guy in the sense that capitalism for him is a crisis of transcendence, which has an answer of mimetic desire. So yeah, you got it. It's all there for you. but it's a kind of bland power relations. It's a kind of it's not the power relations of religion. You know what I mean? Like religion restores to sort of a third solution to that, or a way out of that, I feel like. So it's an uninteresting, in some sense, mimetic desire is uninteresting because it's so structural. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ways I think you could look at desire as to understand it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time, my interest in it again is to sort of bring it up and look at it, because a lot of times we do bury it and we
Yes.
don't think about it, and we talk about reason or facts or knowledge or all these other things, and it seems like that's a really good topic to consider, and how does it work exactly?
Yeah.
I like what Lacan does, and I like what some of the Eastern religions do. And the idea is sort of that you can only give ground to desire. So you can only sort of desire something and want it and do it, or not.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of everywhere. And I think that's something Girard also doesn't consider, which is sort of, we can have all these desires and we can have all these ways to fulfill desires. But desire isn't sort of satisfied.
Well, desire, if desire is founded on nothingness ultimately, but is only the effect. Remember, I made that little arrow off of the thing, which is it's the effect of the rival model. Like, you know what I mean? You need a model. Like desire comes about not when you have a rival. That's not it. It's when you have the model from the rival. So it's almost like desire emerges always in three. There's me, rival, and then the model that's going on there.
Yeah.
Stage one. Then, stage two is, okay, what the hell does this model come from? And then you go up and it's like, oh, okay, it's based on this. Oh, well, that is actually producing a new obstacle. So we have a new, there's like each one is a kind of little tripartite impasse.
Yes.
Anyways. But yeah, I think the Gnosticism piece is basically that the whole thing is really not a secret. There are secrets that are concealed, but the foundation is secretless. And to me, that's a really weird, depressing, not depressing, but it's something. I just don't know if I like the Gnostic, speaking spiritually. I'm not sure that Gnosticism satisfies me. I don't know about you all, but
it also seems to me that in Violence and the Sacred, Girard does a really good job when cherry picking certain ethnographic examples or going to particular ancient texts and literature. Like, it's convincing to me. Like, you see how it works and you see the structure at play. But when he talks about modernity, as you were saying, I just don't, it never seems to transpose itself. In some sense, you can say, okay, capitalism, there's lots of mimetic desire there. But part of what Girard laments over and over again is the loss of distinctions, right, under capitalism. But if you're thinking with someone like, I don't know, Marx or someone like this, it's, okay, yes, distinctions are being erased all the time, but new ones are also always being put in place. For the distinctions that are destroyed, new ones are being erected. And it's this process. And he never really talks about new distinctions being made, for instance, in any real way.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. Yeah, like I think Rose makes the nice point, which is Hegel's master-slave dialectic is not, yes, it is a theory of the conflict of two self-consciousnesses. And so it's abstracted to this sphere of reality, but by no means should it be thought of as this kind of transhistorical account of conflict that is necessarily originary. No, actually, it's like a very historically specific problem emerging in the European feudal structure and confronting the post-French Revolutionary emergence of the bourgeois social order. And I just feel like Girard does not give ample sensitivity to the complexity of what we might call the sociological, right? He gives a lot of ground to the ethnographical. Part of that also is perhaps the same sense in which, you know, if you actually look at ethnographical structuralism, it has a similar tendency to, as you said, cherry pick, but to sort of integrate social modeling from other contexts and envision alternative arrangements, which is very cool. It's kind of like sci-fi. It's not quite science, like sci-fi, you know? I mean, that's the whole thing with Deleuze and Guattari taking Bali as an example of a non-repressive society and then imagining how social zones of intensity might function in the Western context, similar to Bali. I feel like any Deleuze and Guattari scholar should take their vacation or their honeymoon to Bali, because so much is indebted to this insight from structural ethnography, you know?
I actually know one who did. He was an archaeologist down in DC, actually. He's associated with the rhizome there. Mike something, he actually wrote a pretty good book on a coal mine massacre that happened up where I am. So we talked about that a lot. But he did an archaeological study of Bali. And actually the main thing he came back talking about it, from what I remember from discussion, was how regimented their time was. Like since they worked on a seasonal calendar still, like it's not like there was more like free time. Like everything was ritualized. So you didn't have like clocks and wristwatches, but since everything was kind of like predicated upon cycles of seasons, even on like the daily level, there was no free time. You're always preparing for a festival, cleaning up from a previous sort of thing. Like that was kind of striking a little bit. Sorry about that.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I posted this on Twitter earlier, but Girard said that Oedipus was a book written as a theological proposal, grappling kind of like Nietzsche part 2 with how we create a philosophy of life after the death of God. So it's like this beautiful theory of the double, of like, okay, we have a crisis of the double crisis of the and then that doubleness as a motif linking to delirium and to the subject of the schizophrenic as a fundamental subject of duality. Incidentally, the Bali example was one in which there was a kind of society which was very good, apparently, from what little I know about it, of it was a non-binary social order, right? And if you read like the late Guattari, I'm actually reading his very interesting book on ecology. You know, he keeps all of the concepts that they developed in Anti-Oedipus all the way through. And what you find is that he is insisting over and over and over that true ethical life has to insist on this kind of non-binary, right? So it's actually very different, I think, than the Anti-Oedipus notion of a kind of riding the double all the way to the end, you know? He's kind of mutated that or shifted that a little bit. He's worth looking at, I would say. Guattari is. Um, but yeah, anyways, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm glad we did this because I feel like Girard is hard to read sometimes. You know, he's sort of it's you know, there's some text that you kind of dive in and you sort of swim to the bottom eagerly. With Girard, it's a struggle. I feel, you know, there's a little bit more of a kind of but the payoff is good, right? The payoff is there. So I really enjoyed it, and hopefully you all did as well. More needs to be done on the diagramming, though. You know, the visualizing of this stuff is really so helpful. You know, to me at least. I'm almost insisting now at the end of every book, if you can't diagram it, you didn't fully grasp it. You know.
That's another thing I was thinking with Girard too. Maybe not so much of a natural science, but since he does propose something of like a scientific theory in the, let's say, Hegelian sense, I think there does seem to be the capacity to like algebraicize it the way that like Lacan does to Freud. Like it seems to like with what you're talking about with the diagrams too, it seems like you could get something of an algebra of what he's talking about.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like if Girardians are correct that, you know, he's the Darwin of the human sciences, of the humanities. I think it's kind of funny because like we look at Darwin now as like so fractured, and like, yes, he laid down some truths, but the way in which you take those up is certainly not scientific, right? There are like so many multiple consequences from the Darwinian discovery. You know what I'm saying? And so like, I don't know, like in the grand scheme of things, we'll see where Girard stands. I feel like the verdict is still out on that question of Girard's legacy in some ways. I don't know. But it's been really interesting. I'm really glad we did this. Because I also feel like a lot of people don't give him enough attention. Do you all feel that way as well?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled on him, I think, by accident. Like I never heard anybody talk about him, and sort of ran across him, and I was like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
You know, I never heard any secondary literature. I never heard anybody talk about him, and I was like, wow, this seems like important. Like this guy, he wrote a lot of books. What's going on? So I like bought all of his books. I was like, I want to read about this guy. I want to know what he's talking about. So
yeah. I'm really happy we did, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And our little efforts to decipher will be on YouTube, and hopefully others can benefit from them.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks
This was
for
great.
doing the group, Daniel.
Yeah, it's been
super
fun.
great. Yeah,
it's been enjoyable to be with you all, and I hope you guys have a nice Christmas. And is anybody traveling? No.
staying.
Nope.